Hello again everyone, my name is James Victor, author of the Orient, and today I just wanted to share to you guys what my beta readers have been saying about my work. I've scoured the web in search of those willing to suffer through my manuscript, and here's what they've said so far. First place I went to was the subreddit Beta Readers, but I received no response. I tried the subreddit PH Book Club, but then they just redirected me back to the subreddit Beta Readers. But I did find some fellow Filipinos on Reddit. Some of them are even writing themselves. I had a beta reader who read my first chapter say, "About the multiple POVs, I generally don't mind this and I think the plot is easy enough to understand so far. It does seem like a more plot-focused story so far than a character-focused one." That's true. Since I'm Tagalog, I can catch the meaning of some of these non-English terminologies. Although as a fantasy reader, I don't know if I've ever read anything with as many foreign words as this one in the first 3 chapters. Even if I know some Tagalog words, I found myself Googling to confirm whether my understanding of the word's meaning was correct or aligned with how they use it in your story's world. Sorry, I skipped the glossary. If you find yourself not wanting to cut down certain words, you might want to consider providing a bit more context of what they are in your secondary world using your POV character's interiority, perhaps in between some of the back and forth dialogue. Honestly, I think you'd benefit from having a non-Filipino beta reader to really gauge this aspect. Overall, it seems that you really did your research, so kudos. But nothing came out of that. Total silence after this last message. I also joined this Facebook group called Book Buddies to find some more fellow Filipinos. I found some people who sounded enthusiastic about beta reading at first, but they were not straightforward enough to just tell me that they're not interested. I found that to be the case with a lot of Filipinos that I've encountered during my beta reading journey. They're too polite to just formally and explicitly decline. It's always no reply equals not interested. But at least I got to participate on the group regularly organized. I should check out some of the other events they have lined up. Of course, one of my goals with my work is to introduce Filipino history and mythology to the wider world, as that one Redditor talked about earlier. So I had to find foreigners who's interested in reading new and diverse settings. That's how I ended up in the website Critique Match, which is a good dedicated place to swap manuscripts with other aspiring writers. Here's some of the comments that I've got there. Now, as to beta reading this work, I would pass. This is entirely subjective, but the prose doesn't mesh with my brain. You're a fine writer. Thank you. But this prose appears as if it's trying to be some kind of throwback to decades past and is not something I'm keen to read. There are a lot of extra words, adverbs, adjectives, and an overall padding to the prose that doesn't jive with my brain. Darted his glistening eyes is an example. Again, I can't stress this enough. This is purely subjective. Other readers may delight in this style of prose, and if they do, then that's your target audience. I was disappointed by a lot of the straightforward honesty. Compare that to this one. I really enjoyed your writing prose, and the story so far is really compelling. You seem to have a good grasp on line writing, which is great. I saw very little mistakes. I could just tell she didn't read it. She didn't even highlight anything from the manuscript. No individual comments whatsoever. She said she saw little mistakes. What were the little mistakes? I also had another person who I swapped manuscripts with. The first manuscript I finished all the way through. What frustrated me the most about this particular exchange is how much work I did into critiquing his manuscript, which was more than 120,000 words. I highlighted every chapter, gave feedback on plot and character, the story structure, from start to finish. I'd be okay if he only commented on 120,000 words out of my 180,000 words manuscript. But he didn't. He stopped less than 1/3 through. I thought I'd be happy to see those comments on those 1/3 anyway, but they didn't highlight anything that much, and they just summarized the critique in the end. I started out making some notes in the comments as I went, trying to explain what I thought were the plot points. After a while, I switched to just reading to try to go faster. There were a number of different things that combined to make this difficult for me to read. One is my lack of language skills, in particular Spanish, Portuguese, and the languages of the Philippines, which play a big part in the text. Another is syntax. There are many sentences that are technically correct, but the arrangement and word choice caused me to stop and reread in order to build an understanding. Sometimes this requires assumptions and guessing on my part as to what you mean. Another is the use of unknown expressions and sayings that are not always obvious in meaning. Many of these are flowery, poetic, or dramatic language which does not help clarify things. I know that I make a lot of effort to explain things as plainly and directly as I can when writing, but even so, readers still must understand. Communication itself is hard, especially when you are dealing with fantasy or historical things. Your reader may have no comprehension of beyond the information you provide. A main part of the story is built around the mythology of the Philippines, of which I am sadly ignorant. These elements are not described in much detail or given context that help me understand and relate to them. This might require more exposition than seems to be popular in storytelling nowadays, but the dialogue used simply did not explain what was going on, or why, sufficiently for me to really get involved. Obviously, my own shortcomings account for a lot of my difficulties here, but I found the text so laborious to read that it prevented me from being pulled into the story, relating to the characters, and finding a compelling reason to engage with the plot. This is why you shouldn't give everything to another person, because that person might just not reciprocate the same thing in the end. I'm talking about beta reading. I've always thought of adding many Filipino words and concepts into my manuscript, and I always believed that I shouldn't cater too much to today's readers, especially with the many things I see online. But I have come to realize that I should strike a better balance. I prematurely thought that I did strike a good balance before, but reading my beta readers' response helped me understand how my writing comes across as to other people, especially foreigners. And it's alright to hold their hands a little bit, especially if the book has a setting that's unfamiliar to them. I once posted on Goodreads to find some beta readers there, but I didn't get a response and eventually forgot about it. But sometime later, when I checked it out again, I found that 2 people did end up responding. One of them was actually Filipino. They ended up not responding like the other ones. But there was the other one, and this one was the most in-depth beta reader I've had so far. I've swapped manuscripts with them, so I'm working to match their contribution to my work. But I had a slight disagreement with them, and I think it was because I was kind of getting frustrated. I haven't had the pleasure of getting a reader immersed with what I've written, which is a big problem if I want to get published. I was reading some of their comments and I was hoping that I could get someone to connect with my work. Again, you could explain a bit what this means. He said readers need to be open-minded when reading this, and trust me, people who pick up your story will be open to unfamiliar culture, but will need all the help we can get to immerse you in your world. I think your first chapters might not be confusing because they have too many names and unfamiliar cultural stuff, but because the names and culture aren't well explained. You can think in both directions, cutting some less important characters and adding more well-placed expositions. I'm genuinely curious, and I'll be happy if you could answer this question for me. How common is this genre today? I'm kind of curious if there are still authors writing in this genre. If there are, then that's great because you have your target audience there. Yeah, I tried, but I do think your language is part of what's hindering me from understanding your story. This is the point where I get a bit too frustrated with the language in unfamiliar setting. This could simply be because your story might not be for me. Come back later when I'm less exhausted by work and life. After reading all of that, I sent them this email. I'm kinda starting to feel that you're about to DNF. This is a Filipino historical epic fantasy, as I have mentioned before giving the manuscript. This is probably the biggest obstacle I have with my book when it comes to foreign readers. I could search specifically for Filipino readers, but that defeats the purpose of why I'm writing this. How I want to introduce our history and folklore to the world, with my creative liberty of course. What I'm searching for are readers who are open to new, fantastical, and diverse settings, and are not easily turned off or frustrated by something unfamiliar. If ever you are about to DNF, perhaps you could introduce me, if possible, to fantasy readers who you feel will be more receptive to this. They responded, perhaps you could consider what you're trying to achieve by having a beta reader, someone who would share your vision 100% and help you fix some big plot/character issues you have in mind, which is a very, very particular person, or simply general readers who enjoy historical fantasy genre, who may be turned off by new stuff presented in a vague manner. So while readers want to be excited, want to be introduced to an unfamiliar setting, we also want some familiarity to ground us. That's why tropes are very common in fantasy, and why sometimes historical fantasy will have to tweak the original culture a bit so it's more palatable to international readers. Also, none of the historical fantasy I read used flowery language like you do. So if your target reader is historical fantasy readers, that will be another instance of unfamiliarity for us. So that's just something for you to consider. Luckily, we moved past that and just continued beta reading. In the end, I cut out more than half of the foreign words I added, and I made 100% sure that all of these words could be understood, even without flipping back to the glossary every now and then. And I made sure all of the foreign concepts could be properly understood, even without having to Google them. I have my own take with some of these concepts anyway. After reading and watching so many rules about writing, I always felt that I shouldn't write too much exposition, too much info dumping, that I should do more subtext and not make my characters speak too directly, all of which I still follow, but I have to pull back a little bit on those things, especially since my story is largely unfamiliar to most readers. And it's okay to think about your intended audience and not just always about your own artistry. Because at the end of the day, art is also about communication. And if you're not communicating well, then you're not doing art well. So that's it for today's video. My beta readers still have a lot to say. They're not done yet, but these critiques have been really good for me. It helped me understand the spots that I could still improve in my writing. So yeah, that's it. Bye-bye.